On my screen currently, I have a quiz, the number 1 quiz pulled up, and most of you have completed it, if not one person. I'm not going to be helping anyone too much by what I'm showing right now, but I want to get down to this question. So question number 6, a number of you had feedback from me. 1 second. I'm going to ask the room to be a little bit quieter. Okay, so some of you had some feedback from me on question number 6. I had so many answers to this question. Describe and summarize the foundations of early culture interior design. What I was looking for, a few of you took foundations to be a structural word, which is true. It has a context of being structural at certain times. So you gave me an architectural description of the different structural pieces. 1 second, I'm going to mute you all. I have some feedback. Other people took it to be different parts of certain headers and summarized what you felt you hadn't already answered in previous questions. What I was truly looking for were, by foundations, I mean kind of the culmination of the motifs, the architecture, the styles, how you're using the elements. If you were to build a space that was representative of that time, what are the culminating underlying things? So I don't know if it's too vague. Some of you, I gave a description of what I was looking for. I thought the book in the precedence chapter did a good job of it at almost the beginning of the chapter. I'm turning to page 4. So where it says on the first full paragraph at the bottom, these types reflect the group's attitudes, influences, and changes in behavior, social structure, environment, climate, materials, construction technologies, where it starts to say materials define the overall character of the image. Interiors generally imitate the architectural form with an emphasis on functional context rather than decorative display, and furnishings during these early periods are few or non-existent. So that was pretty much a summary, a nice, clear, concise description that brought in a little bit about furniture, a little bit about our motifs and the emphasis, the overall concepts and the historical and social pieces. That's what I was looking for, the foundation, a good summary. I might go through if I see continuing struggle to answer that question and take it out, or give automatic points if everybody misses it. There was a good majority on this first test. It was worth talking about. So I'm going to exit out of the quiz and move on ahead into my class session. So my first 2 PowerPoints are available to you. Some of you might have gone through them very briefly, possibly read them all. I said we could do that since we were doing housekeeping last week. It'd give you a good idea of what we were to have covered in precedence in East Asia. I mentioned briefly as I opened it up that it will add a piece of the pie that's missing, so our exterior environment, our landscaping design, into the class. We used to have an extra book that did that, but as a saving money to you, we've decided to remove it and just incorporate it into the content of the PowerPoint. All right. So I'm not going to be extremely brief, as I think even if you read some of it on your own, it's worth going over the last 2 weeks and getting a feel for more of the sacred gardens and garden design in general. And there'll be pieces of extra history outside of your book revisited in these slides. Not everything is gardens. If you've gone through that, you would have noticed. It also helps give us the context of how it applies to our own lives. So welcome to ADSN 210. We did the introduction part. What is home a place for? So this is a better way to view this class. How is it related to you? So home is a place for survival, protection, security, family, love, sustenance, health, entertainment, recreation, creativity, learning, procreation, peace, retreat, relaxation, nature, development, business, magic, a place to grow old, spirit, religious practices and beliefs, hygiene and cleanliness, camaraderie, connection, values, reflection, prestige, symbolic, cultural, heritage. So our homes, for the most part, I'd say I could have a general consensus as are very valuable to us. I'm in the process myself of moving from a home which, when I had graduated from college a number of years ago, I moved into and eventually married my husband, and after we were married, he moved in. So I moved in, my father had owned the real estate and we bought it from him. So I never went through the process of picking out my own home, and I recently was able to select my own home, and it's such a wonderful feeling to be involved in that process, and so it's becoming more and more meaningful to me at this current point. There's different times, different priorities, it says. So economy, politics, religion, and technology, intellect versus emotions. These are all things that help shape and inform our idea of what a home is a place for. And there's different locations and different resources available to different people groups. So here we have different times, different priorities. How does this relate to some of the earliest people? So some of you had brought it up in your research associated with the Session 1 visual assignment. We have protection, animals, marauders, the elements were a big concern back then, thick walls, few windows, floor plans, so those became things that transitioned to the now, but they were still concerned with uses of animals, just in a different way. So back then, animals were much more necessary. We used all the different pieces of the animal, both as food and to build into the structure for protection from the elements. Food production, fences, water collection, kitchens, and cooking are all things that there's a drastic difference from the earlier peoples to now, and we're going to see that progression as we go throughout the class. Immigration, memory, furniture, architecture, color, symbols. What do we bring? What do we hold precious? That was the piece where I talked about it's become a thing where we don't really have a carbon footprint anymore. We're going more and more to digital. We're losing our memories and photos on a daily business because it's up in the cloud and it goes missing. So thinking about how that affects us eventually will be an interesting topic of discussion. But back then we have very clear ideas from the paintings on the walls and from any relics or items that we were able to uncover as we did, because they were very good about saving those things. The earlier ones, just because they've disappeared over time or eroded, we don't have a ton of information, but getting into the middle periods, we have lots of information. Learning, science, books, bookcases, entertaining, Maslow's hierarchy, lower survival, higher enlightenment, love, and romance. Technology, cold weather, HVAC, communication. So there's things in here that we see hints of what these will be and why they came to being as we review these pre-peoples. So this is just interesting. It lays out what is going on. How are things transitioning over time? So as we progress, we'll talk about the ornateness of certain things and color and how that became a factor as opposed to pure function over aesthetic at the beginning. And really what materials were available and how that's opened up our eyes to what furniture and architecture could be. Mastering your craft. So we need to know our history. When was electricity first installed in homes? Plumbing, gas? When was concrete first used? When was glass used in windows? When was HVAC developed? I talked about, even more important than when was glass used in windows, there's hundreds of types of windows, and it makes a difference once we have the curtain walls of glass that were used for skyscrapers, that they were able to go higher in a building than ever before. So when did that transition happen, that we could go from one story to multiple story buildings? Where's your city center? How did your city grow? Date the neighborhoods. So a lot of us have shown some expressed interest in some of our answers historic building and preservation. I find that fascinating. I did a little bit of that with special topics, although we didn't go too in depth. All of those things are dependent on knowing our history well. So this is a starting need-to-know class. Know the elements and principles of design. Travel as much as you can. That's one I wish I would have done more before I planted my roots. Learn French or Latin. I myself have taken Latin and loved it. I think Spanish too would be one that I would have wished I would have learned more of. How religions spread across the world, Business Weekly. So we don't have great capabilities of playing videos like this, but in your own free time, now that the PowerPoint's available to you, just take the time and click on this link and watch this video. It's really fun to watch how people groups have moved and changed over time and the spread as it associates with religion. Each period, there's historical considerations, design concepts, motif, architecture, interiors, furnishings, decorative arts, gardens and landscapes, historical influences, historical designers, artists, and architects. So each of these things was highlighted in your syllabus as what we're concentrating on and what our book lays out each of its chapters as. So very clear where we're going, where to begin in the beginning. So historical need. There was a need for places of meditation, refuges from rawness of life, sacred plantings to heal or refresh, enclosed safe space to escape from the world. Today's need. We still need places to meditate, refuge where we feel close to the wildness of nature, sacred plantings to heal or refresh, and a place to share with the company of friends. So this is more getting into the context of garden design. And you can, it'll help you too if you see the references of the books that were used to create the PowerPoint. It kind of interweaves the two, the architecture and the gardening. So heaven on earth. The Chinese had ancestor gardens, the Japanese had Zen gardens of harmony and balance, and Persian and Indians had geometric symbolism representing the Garden of Eden and the 4 divisions of the universe. Medieval Christians had a place of enlightenment and a home for the soul. English country, there was an informal style balancing personal needs with needs of nature. Herb gardens, a symbol of love and faithfulness, and Renaissance, a balance of art and nature on cosmic order. So before writing pieces of these slides, to me, gardens were a lot more vague. They didn't have much thought put into them. I thought of them more as interiors, but with less inspiration. So I thought more about balance and harmony as opposed to a more psychological and social context for those gardens and just how healing they truly could be and how much more they were. But we see them throughout time, and we'll see a lot more of them in the coming slides. So heaven on earth, here's a quote for you. Botanical gardens. It would be necessary to travel the globe collecting all the plants that had been created and assembling them into collections that would be, in effect, a catalog of the contents of the Garden of Eden. Since God had created plants to provide medicine in their leaves, flowers, bark, or berries, any collection that contained all the plants in the world must contain a cure for every illness in the world. So that's just an interesting concept. We're not trying to give you any pure thoughts on religion at all, but it's just a unique way to consider just how many plants are truly out there and that they have so many multiple uses and purposes as it pertains to our health. These first botanic gardens began in Europe as gardens of recreation, literally where people could see the plants that grew in the first garden and renew themselves spiritually. This idea spread beyond the scientific botanic gardens and became the principle behind every recreational garden. Some gardens are created to grow fruits or vegetables, but a garden that exists for the recreation is just that, a recreation of the Garden of Eden. So there's plenty of garden types. There's floral gardens, the sacred grove, grottos and shrines, the farm garden, the small and useful garden, the private pleasure garden, the paradise garden, and the garden of pleasure, heaven on earth. Walled garden, Garden of Eden, Elysian fields. Locus ammonius, the pleasant place, the garden of delight, but not of usefulness, most often seen as the medieval garden in the forest, centered round a flowery mead, a space of a meadow, grass sprinkled with innumerable flowers, where Adam and Eve, virgin and child, knights and ladies, will gather for moments of recreation and delight. So garden theory, location. Consult the genius of the place in all that tells the waters or to rise or fall. So that's Alexander Pope in 18th century England. Garden types. What kind of gardens to create? So there's domestic for the body, health, and well-being. Animal and plant gardens for mind, activity, hunting, parks, botanical gardens. Spiritual religious gardens for the spirit, ritual, mythological, doctrinal, ethical, social, experiential. And estate gardens and villas. Aesthetics, how to shape the gardens. So a lot of times, especially we're going to be looking at Chinese gardens, so we'll see grid satisfying logical and identifiable, Pythagorean theory and mathematical proportions, and then Palladio's form of goodness, justice and harmony, the circle, the square, and the harmonic proportion. So there's much more thought probably placed on gardens even in the earlier peoples than we might have today and locally been accustomed to. Aesthetics, how to shape gardens. Garden type diagrams and garden styles. So domestic garden, palace garden, hunting park, paradise garden, medieval garden, and landscape style. So some of it is a little bit repetitive, but it'll be good review for you because I've added an option for your homework, which we'll review later, that is going to pertain to gardens up into the third session. And there's a lot of talk even in this first session of the medieval gardens. So under primitive conditions, the cultivation and design of gardens could only begin when a wandering tribe found a place to settle. The nomad drove his herds across the open, unfenced pastures. When, however, with the aid of the pickaxe, he broke the ground for cultivation and fixed a dwelling place, he was compelled to erect a fence in order to protect the homestead from enemies and wild beasts. This enclosure, rudimentary as it was, formed the first garden. It was earlier than the farm, which could only be developed after fields had been formed with further fencing. So this is talking about our precedent cultural people who were nomadic for the most part, but they didn't see the garden until they were able to figure out how to control animals, create herds, and set down an actual homestead. Before that, it was just not a need to them. As they were traveling all the time, they'd exhaust their resources and move on. So it begins in warmer countries of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Persia around 6000 BC. From a nomadic to agrarian culture, learn to harvest water from rivers or melting mountain snow through dams or canals, turning deserts to rich, fertile, and cultivated land. Water was a life force, critical element in Chinese, Persian, Renaissance, and Zen gardens, delightful sounds and sight. Trees were symbolic of the tree of life and permanence. Any green spot was considered sacred. Two garden styles developed, vast landscape park, smaller contained gardens. First gardens were probably useful fruit, vegetables, herbs, and medicine. As domesticated crops brought wealth and culture, plants were grown for interest, pleasure, and offerings to the gods. So we're moving into China. Chinese influenced. Their greatest reach of imagination is employed in contriving figures where the beauties shall be great and strike the eye, but without any order or disposition of part, that shall be commonly or easily observed, and though we have hardly any notion of this sort of beauty, yet they have a particular word to express it, and where they find it hit their eye at first sight, they say the Shirawagdi is fine. So a little bit different concept than we saw with the earlier pupils. It's kind of lending itself towards the feng shui principles that we recognize from the first chapter we read. shows Sharawagdi, the quality of being impressive or surprising through carelessness or unorderly grace. Yan Yi Gardening, Tempering explains, there are no definite rules for the planting of gardens. I feel like that's how my garden is. There's definitely no rules in my garden. If an Italian, French, or even English gardener steeped in his native pragmatism had read Yan Yi, it would have been dismissed or nonsense, for gardening was nothing if not a set of fundamental rules reflecting precise geometric principles for controlling nature. To become one with the ebb and flow of the natural order of things was and is a source of great creative power for the garden designer and in any tradition. The great mountains, misty river valleys, lakes, waterfalls has inspired Chinese poets, landscape painters, and garden makers. To the north, Gobi and Mongolian deserts, the west, snow-covered mountains, sharp mountain ranges, fertile river valleys and rivers. To the south, the monsoon blows in from the sea in the summer, making the forest luxuriant and prolific. The southern part of China is crisscrossed with alluvial plains and is within the tropic zone. The number and variety of plants and trees exceed any other country in the world. So here we see the 17-span bridge. The qualities of the yin and yang, which was mentioned in the first chapter, mountains rough and masculine, are balanced with soft reflective water, the yin. The juxtapose of the mountains, water, and the Chinese landscape is an expression of the yin and yang. The orchestration of high places leads to low ground, open spaces suddenly close, and shade becomes sunny, and a wide passage turns narrow in the garden's composition. So here we can see that juxtaposition where you have that tremendous amount of jagged height, and then located in front of it you have the structure with the very soft round forms of the lily pads and the water line. Early gardens. Where gardens developed behind walls out of uneasy, threatening sense of the wilderness, Chinese garden makers seem to have been free of any such paranoia. Walls were built to preserve and hold the good spirit inside the garden. Lawns were considered meaningless. So the Qin Dynasty, 221 to 206 BC. Great hunting parks with collections of rare animals and plants became a powerful symbol of imperial power under the Emperor Shi Huangdi. The garden became a symbol of power for all the emperors to come. Recreating a miniature universe inspired the emperors to stock the parks with all kinds of curious and exotic animals and birds. Rare fowl were particularly prized and acquired at a great cost as a living garden ornament. So such a strange concept to think that they wanted to kind of collect one of everything and keep it within the confines of their property. A peculiarly Chinese theme was the legendary search for immortality. The mythological exploration was somehow transformed into the recreation of the idealized natural landscape for the immortals, enchanted demigods of the Chinese lore. Strangely shaped boulders were believed to have special power and were worshipped as local gods. In their dense sculptured shapes, it was believed that the stones condensed the forces of rationality in nature by containing them in the garden. The gardener was demonstrating his control over nature's unruly powers. So here we'll continue to talk a little bit about Taoism. So I think it is important to focus on the water and how much that meant to them. There's an equal reverence for water. Rivers represent the life arteries of the earth. Mountains were the skeleton. Water being so essential to life was also essential to the artist in his compositions. So here's two more examples of just how dominant water became within the properties. And also how they kind of created these structures surrounded by water and connected with bridges. So the Chinese became masters of life-giving water design. If water was not available for a stream or pond, then dry stones could be laid to evoke a running brook. An empty pond was supposed to stimulate the viewer's imagination into conjuring up a reflecting mirror or water. This was confusing to the Western gardener. Some more examples. So they have completeness, disclosure and concealment, wonder and surprise, entrance into a separate reality, the mirror and mirroring, large and small, and returning to the source in association with water. So here we have just expansion on completeness. And then we start getting into feng shui. So it requires a knowledge of feng shui, the art of discovering the powerful hidden cosmic currents that affect a site. Requires a tradition that prepares visitors for the suspension of disbelief. The Chinese garden unfolds along with winding paths, very much like a scroll painting or unwinding from right to left. Paths. Oh, yeah, there you go. Earliest meaning of the word dao is road, path, or way. Higher allegorical implication. Decorative element of the garden layout, often in mosaic or brick patterns. Pebbles create pictures in a relief and are used as visual accents. Through a homogeneous composition, the isolated scenes or sections relax a visitor's grip on his disbelief, strolling past the lakes and mountains over bridges, along walls, and through doorways. In small spaces, doorways and gates are particularly important elements of the design. They divide the space to create mystery and surprise. The shape of the door or opening is quite often fanciful and symbolic. A circle, perhaps, is a sign of heaven. So even when the Chinese gardens, and we see the focus on the circle, we saw how important the circle was to our prehistoric or early precedent people, and similar relationships to heaven or the religious connotations. Cosmic. Entrance into a separate reality. Yipu Garden of Ming Dynasty. Isn't that neat, just the visual separation of the circle that's cut throughout the different portions of the walls, lending itself to draw your eye in and through. Wonder and surprise. So here we can see the plantings and how it causes you to move this way throughout and then landing your focus on the focal point of the building. Here's the mirroring. How beautiful. Miniature Chinese garden with Buddhist temple. So flower motifs appear in Chinese art, and each conveys a specific meaning. Unlike in the West, where flowers and paintings are more often used for pure aesthetic purposes, flowering trees, such as the blossoming plum tree, were prized as the harbingers of spring. The orchid and the chrysanthemum are among the most popular of those flowering plants in the Chinese gardens. Bamboo was a symbol of lasting friendship and longevity and was one of the most important plants in the Chinese garden. With over 100 species, it was most often combined with the plum and the pine, symbolizing the hardiness and strength of character. The green bamboo provided contrast against the harmony of the gnarled pine branches and the picturesque garden rocks. The lotus, sacred flower of the Buddhism, and the flower of paradise, the symbol of noble endeavor and spiritual purity. So if nothing else, as we're going through the PowerPoint and we're looking at just how much thought was put into all of the elements, so every single planting that was used, and the juxtaposition of those plantings. How different is that from today? I'm sure there's some purists out there, but how different than our experience where I go to the local nursery to get my plants and I'm picking them possibly by color or overall scale. And what a unique concept to apply to a future project, to put that much thought into some of our outdoor plants. Within reason, because you want to be having an eye to the actual plants allowed in Indiana or your location. The making of Chinese garden continued. So Ernest Wilson, plant collector, introduced into England more than 1,000 plants from the wilds of China. Flowers and trees. While Western gardens overflow with Chinese species of rhododendron, rosa, rugosa, azalea, lilac, camellia, lily, giant clematis, tree peony, and primula, the Chinese garden maker is restrained in the cultivation of flowers in the garden. The placing of the building goes beyond the finding the genius of place. Building placement is one of the great arts of the East. It must be placed in the absolute harmony with the natural surroundings. The interpretation of indoor and outdoor spaces manages to dissolve the distinction between indoor and outdoor. So that's one of the #1 things you might hear in some of your other class, whether it's intro or advanced, all of those larger culminating projects. Thinking about the windows as this very slim separation between the two environments, the outdoor and the indoor, and thinking of them as just framing in, our windows framing in what we see outside. So we want it to be visually stimulating and beautiful, and oftentimes it gets left to the very end. I know, especially when you're struggling through the beginning of the design process. It's one of those things that gets thrown to the very last afterthought. So Ying Mountain House are more examples, and here we can see the importance of doorways, water, bridges. Here's the bamboo. And some of these actual pictures were pictures that Professor Kent took on some of her travels. So she's been luckier than I to be able to visit these places herself. And just look at all of those decorative elements and how much detail was put into that. All those pieces attached to the roof, all the cutting that they had to do, each and every piece of tile that they had to lay, and just the sheer height of some of their buildings. Very impressive. The wall. Then we have inner city. It's all visually stimulating, beautiful, lots of repetition, lots of color. All right, so history of environmental design, the Japanese design. And I might speed through some of these so then we can move on. I'm going to pause for a second as I have a text from one of your classmates, and I want to make sure that I'm not stopping someone from being able to get on. Okay, so she is able to hear me. That's fine. If you can at least hear me, that's fine, and I'll post the video later. So, Japanese design. Let's see what the differences are from the Chinese design. Any remarkable phenomenon, from a splendid tree to a striking rock, from a waterfall to a cliff, can be an object of worship. Where the medieval European saw malignant spirits in every forest and mountain demanding to be exorcised or subdued, the contemporary Shinto seemed to have felt an instinctive reverence for every stone, tree, plant, and animal. For the primitive Japanese, the sun, moon, sea, earth, mountains, wells, and springs were imbued with a spiritual quality worthy of veneration and worship. The word niwa, or garden, is used to indicate a piece of ground purified for worship of the gods. Most religious sanctuaries in Japan, whether Shinto or Buddhist, are preceded by water basins where the visitor can purify with fresh water before entering the sacred realm. At Ise, the basin is provided with metal dippers from which one may take a sip of the water or rinse one's hand. The fountain at Ise is a miniature replica of the typical shrine structure, with its simple overhanging gable roof resting on the smooth cylindrical posts. The basin is hollowed for natural rock for a typically Shinto rustic appearance. And here we have an example of some of those basins. Immense sky and aggressive sea, island landscapes are small and varied. Volcanic origins, soft rounded mountains, and river valleys take up 7/8 of the land, and no native grass and open meadows to support animals. Intensively cultivated fields in the valleys on the hillsides, limiting space for both humans and agriculture. Efficient and mathematically controlled pockets of intense cultivation, and no level of English lawns or pastures. So we see a lot of similarities between the two and some differences in the landscape itself, but not so much in the concepts behind it. Though the topography was extremely different, China had an enormous influence on Japanese art, literature, and gardening. During Japan's cultural infancy, China was vast, bleak, and inhuman compared to tiny Japan. In 794, near Nara, Hangzhou, the capital of peace and tranquility was built. It became the height of cultivated refinement of the Heian society, and the elegance probably never has been surpassed by any other civilization. The court nobility concentrated most of its energy and imagination on perfection in the details of exquisite living, from writing poetry to making garden settings for their new Chinese-inspired pavilions. The pavilions were a symmetrical complex inspired by earlier Chinese Tang models, and the main pavilion would have faced onto the lake, large enough for pleasure boating, an important aristocratic pastime. The wings on either side were connected by covered passages and placed close to the lake, where places placed close to the lake were known as fishing pavilions. In front of the main pavilion, there would have been an open space covered with white sand, where entertainments and dance and mime were performed. In the summer, shuttered wall panels and Shinrin-zukuri-style pavilions could be raised so that the interior space became a part of the surrounding gardens. So we have similar gabling and connections. And I'm going to move through a little bit, and you can continue on your own through these. So they will focus more on Buddhism. And here we see some of those paths. We talk about the transition in the Paradise Garden. Give varying examples. Here we talk about the building in relation to its exterior and the dry landscapes. So tons and tons of gardens, even within only 2 cultures in a short period of time. I'll just scroll through because I want to get to the next one, or bonsai, and I'd rather show some of the photos of the dry landscapes and interiors. All right, so each week we'll have a PowerPoint that kind of outlines something outside of your book, but still in line with your book, and then pays close attention to gardens, which are not mentioned clearly in your book. And then I will show you your homework assignment while I transition to the next slide show. So let me go ahead, and I'm going to go into class sessions. All right, we're in week 3, Middle Ages. And then here's your session 3 visual assignment. So what I did this week, always read the notes before starting to download everything at once, although you could download it all and then decide, but it helps to see what's going on, why are there so many files. Note for this week, there are 2 options. There's a product design option and there's a garden research option. So this was meant to give those of you who really enjoy the drawing a chance to do that. Those of you who really enjoy, or we'll say prefer, the research, it might be that you don't enjoy research either, but research is a huge part of what we do. So it just doesn't include any type of sketching with this assignment. I have the 3 documents for each, so that's similar every week. We followed that in housekeeping last week. There'll be the assignment, rubric, the actual assignment, and then the graphic format that you turn the assignment in on. And I have 3 for each of the options. So let me go ahead and open the product design assignment. So that's this one here in the middle. Oh, there we go. Enable editing. Okay, so product design option. Deadline for full credits, 5 p.m. Wednesday of session 4. Design a rug collection. You have been asked to design a collection of rugs for a major manufacturer to be marketed throughout the United States. They have asked for your collection to evoke a mood of 3 of the groups studied this week: Byzantine, Islamic, Romanesque, or Gothic. They would like to see 3 different design options in rectangular shape that would be made in a variety of proportional sizes, also a runner. They have asked that you present your designs as follow. So 1/2 inch scale, rectangular, and then as a runner as well, fully colored and rendered. Present your 3 designs as colored rendered scale drawings in both shape formats. You have a total of 6 drawings, 2 for each. So you're going to have the larger rectangular rug and a matching runner for each. Now the pattern doesn't have to be perfectly matching, just a squished down version of the rectangle, but it should go together. So just different sizes, slightly different, but similar in pattern and style. Write a description of each design concept, pointing out the motifs you use to make your designs authentic. Note, consider the colors that would have been typical of the time and cultures you studied this week, but keep in mind that your rugs will be marketed to today's consumers. Adjust the colors or incorporate additional colors to make your rugs appealing to today's consumers and color schemes. Defend your color selections. So that's fairly clear, and if you have any questions on the rest of the verbiage, it repeats them. Make sure that you're really trying to evoke the style, that you probably need a scanner or to take a good quality photo, and then how I would like it to be turned in and what materials to use, and the grading scale. So this is kind of a fun option, and then you'll be drawing some of the patterns and you have a lot more creative freedom. Okay, so that's all I'm going to cover for that option, but it does have the items you need, so the rubric to see how it's graded, as well as the format to turn it in on. So let's go into the other option. So graphic format, garden research assignment. Nope, here's a rubric. Go back to here. So it's just the first one. And I open it. Oh, pie. Let's see why I keep choosing the wrong one, guys. Did I not click on it? There we go. Haha. So I'll enable editing. So history of environmental design, the Middle Ages. This is the garden research option, which is where our PowerPoints will come in really handy. So this option explores the gardens and landscapes of the era you are studying. The idea is to learn and recognize the design details that make each civilization's style distinctive. For example, how would you know a Roman garden from a Greek garden? Although they are similar in appearance, there are some design details and plannings that are very different and distinctive. And what are the correct names of those design elements? Think about materials, colors, shape, and textures. If a client hired you to redesign the lawn of garden of their Tudor-styled house, what would you recommend? What if their house was an arts and crafts bungalow or an early American Cape Cod, and so on? The intention of this option is to help you learn to recognize plants and features that make the styles distinct. So here's all of the instructions to copy it, and it becomes fairly clear. It's similar to session 2's research option, except you're doing the research on the types of gardens for the 6 options below. And you don't have a large list of options, you just have to do these 6. So research the 6 topics from the list below. Islamic court garden, Islamic Spain gardens, specifically Alhambra, Islamic Indian Pakistan, Mughal gardens, Middle Ages castle garden, and a cloister garden. So you'd be doing research on those items, giving me an inspiration photo, and explaining to me what you would put into those gardens and why. Okay, so 2 options for this week. Can't promise there'll always be 2 options. Sometimes I like to see some of you stretch a little bit one way or the other. So trying to give a variety within the assignments. So let's go back to class sessions. And we're working with format of how the class is laid out. So I functioned from PowerPoint session 1. Now I'll go into antiquity. Session 2, Egyptian, Greek, and Romans. This one has a lot more on the history than the gardens, but it does have some on gardens. And I have to wait for the countdown, so forgive my computer's slowness. While that's running, okay, perfect. Okay. So history of environmental design, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman in the beginning. So we had talked about this slide a little bit, just how things developed over time from getting a fixed dwelling place. Talked about the warmer civilization, water, trees, and green spots considered sacred. That 2 garden landscape styles developed: vast landscape parks, smaller contained gardens, and first gardens were probably useful fruits, vegetables, herbs, and medicine. So then we see now a transition into a new people group than was mentioned in our last. So Sumerians and Assyrians. We had hanging gardens of Babylon, hunting parks established in cooler northern areas where a greater variety of plantings would thrive, and eventually this led to large-scale excavation and irrigation, requiring cheap slave labor. So then we reiterate the 5 garden types that you'll see, and they all apply in this case to Egypt as well. This was in our prior slides from the preceded. So 5 types are fruit and vegetable gardens, small domestic gardens, palace gardens, temple gardens, plant and animal gardens. And be specific in your homework. So you can see now we see Egypt has these, and a lot of these will be in common with different people groups. So when I say castle garden, then I need it to be with an eye towards the Middle Ages, as opposed to another culture that did use the word castle to describe something, and you're totally out of the time period that I'm looking for. So hunting parks were not appropriate for the annual flooding of the Nile, and straight rows were easier they would put things in straight rows for easier irrigation. The irrigation system inspired the geometric garden patterns found throughout the emerging civilized world. So here we can see some of those straight lines. The garden laborer had a brutal life, transporting soil, watering, building up dams with sand and mud, removing sand blown in from the desert, and digging and fertilizing. So that's that cheap slave labor that was back-breaking for the laborer. The gardens were set inside walls with the quite rigid geometric pattern of canals and pools, pavilions, and fruit trees evolving as a basic concept, and the walled enclosure protected valuable plants from floods. In the country, the houses and places were set in a large garden surrounded by a wall. Sometimes there were more than one pond in the garden, and it would be divided into areas. And this looks even similar to when I was showing last week when we were talking about China and Japan and the courtyards. We'll see a lot of similar shapes with the outside exterior wall and some garden existing in a type of grid formation. The front section had a rectangular pond parallel to the river with water plants in it, and there was also date palms and sycamores. The second section in the middle area was enclosed within a wall and planted with light green trees that were perhaps a rare species. And the rear section was the largest area, and again has a rectangular pond bordered on one side by date palms and on the other by sycamores near the rear section. There was an open kiosk. On either long side of the whole garden, an enclosed path was planted with trees of alternating species, while tall trees formed an effective screen at the back of the estate. So here's that effective screen. And here's the variety of probably special species. The garden with house pool was the core of the estate, and plants were imported: date palms, tamarisk, myrrh trees, blue water lily, palmetto, fish pond, sycamore fig. Trees were arranged to frame the entrance ramp, symmetrical arranged of architectural features, trees, ponds, and flower beds. Egypt. Water first a necessity, then a luxury, so not in the flip-flop reverse. Watering the desert, the Egyptian seasons. So here we have a few of the motifs. Animal features, lotus capitals. So here's those lotus capitals. We'll see a lot of the cat. So here we can see the legs of the table has these animal features. The cat was extremely important in their culture. So flowers, herbs, perfumes, vegetables, and food. Here's a good listing of what those were. Egyptian influences. They had sacred lakes and groves, processional ways, peristyle courts with fresco decorations, columns inspired by plant forms, terracing, rectangular pools and plant beds in the walled enclosures, stone and terracotta pots, fine pergolas, plant and animal gardens. Just so much desert. The early gardeners of Egypt, ancient Persia, and Mesopotamia had to solve many horticulture's fundamental problems. In particular, they developed a remarkable expertise in water management that was used to benefit generations to come. The patterns of irrigation they introduced have had a profound influence on the garden layouts ever since. East and west, large and small. While the hunting parks were to be a model for the royal parks of medieval Europe, from which the 18th century landscape park developed, and eventually the city park of today. All right, so here's Greece and Rome, moving out of Egypt. If you have a garden and a library, you have everything you need, quotes Cicero. At the heart of the Greek philosophy regarding natural environment was the conviction that the architectural intervention, whether temple, stoa, theater, agora, or house, must be in harmony with the nature. The natural landscape was sacred, and it was literally the landscape of the gods. There existed a genius loci, and it was the builder's duty to search out and identify the sacred spirit. Peculiar to each location. So I saw one of your messages, and as long as you can get back in, it's okay. If you're ever kicked out, the video will be available and you don't have to worry about it. So no worries. Let me check the chat. Okay, we're good outside of that. The sitting of the Greek temple was not the rational, explicit geometric exercise that we associate with the Roman Renaissance and neoclassical axial planning, but rather a much more intuitive process. No Greek building attempted to dominate the landscape. The Greek genius was to collaborate with it, as though the elements, wild though they might be, yet had some unrecorded harmony. Which is really nice. I think it's interesting in big cities like Chicago or New York that you have so many styles, but to be able to blend things seamlessly is quite a task. All Greek sacred architecture explores and praises the character of a god in a specific place. That place is itself holy, and before the temple was built upon it, embodied the whole of the deity as recognized natural force. Therefore, the formal elements of any Greek sanctuary are first, the specifically sacred landscape in which it's set, and second, the buildings that are placed within it. So here's just a listing of the Greek gods: Athena, Artemis, Poseidon, Dionysius, Demeter, Aphrodite, and each of them had their own place assigned to them. So here's Greek fashion at the time, and this is an interesting link that you could visit to see how that comes into play. So here we have talk again of the sacred grove as it pertains to the Greeks. The sacred grove derives from the religious sanctuaries of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Springs and caves were especially valued for fresh, pure, cool, healthy, and miraculous water. Groves associated with the presiding god were marked by boundary stones. Offerings were made at the outdoor altars, and statues were erected and treasuries built. Shelters built to protect statues became temples, and boundary walls provided security. Sacred groves outside walled towns became places of resort for exercise, gymnasiums, and rest. Philosophers and students came to these places to experience nature and learn about the natural order. So what are the Greek contributions? The Greek city park first served for communal exercise, study, or sacramental purposes connected to shrines and temples. Later, for walking, conservation, and relaxing, the start of the first public pleasure garden. The gardens of the Academy and Lyceum, the groves of the Academy, where Plato held his famous school, was the beginnings of the campus university, and students could wander and reflect while discoursing on philosophy. Olympia had the most famous games, and Delphi the most famous oracle. Sparta emphasized physical prowess, Athens intellectual skills. Stadiums were built for races and shelters, baths and specialized yards, and open colonnades provided summer shade and winter exercise. The gymnasium had a moral, therapeutic, and educational role. Grottos. So caves were associated with the Earth Mother, and caves used for burials, reflection, and prayer. Hellenistic gardens, landowners wanted to view their fields and gardens and the city temple and gymnasium together. Romans were influenced by the McMansion approach: outdoor courts, flower-filled urns, ornamental ponds, vegetables, woods, and exercise with a hot tub and a cold pool. So the agora and the marketplace. Walled and terraced city. The glory of Greece lay in the original thought of grandeur of Rome, in the vast engineering of new ideas, to the establishment of a civil society under the rule of law. The Romans adopted the Greek religion, philosophy, art, architecture, and literature. Small gardens contained shrines. Home in Pompeii had places for offerings and prayers. Public temples were erected in towns. Roman household gods were honored at the property boundaries. Roman roads allowed for spread of knowledge, and Roman governors made gardens wherever they were posted. A garden vocabulary is required. And here we have a Roman dress. So palace gardens, Palatine, villa gardens, Hadrian's villa, town gardens, Pompeii is a good example, and Byzantine gardens, the Hagia Sophia. So palace gardens, open colonnade public garden. Agriculture outside the city walls and villas, and town life, domestic life within the city. So here's Pompeii. We can see an open atrium, pool and fountains, and a fresco wall murals with the Trompe or Fulvii, and then statuary. Sacred groves, we have examples in Delphi and Olympia, classical courts, Delos Pompeii, Palace of the Emperors, Palatine Hill in Rome, villas, the Pompeii's Villa, Pliny's Villa, and Hadrian's Villa. Egyptian campaniform, and Greek Doric, Ionic, and Roman capitals. Oh, sorry, I didn't read the header text for you, which didn't give you enough context. So I'm talking about the capitals of the columns, which I gave you last week when I went through that tour very briefly. So there's Egyptian, which is the campaniform, the Greek Doric, and the Ionic, and then the Romic, which is Etruscan, Ionic, Corinthian. And then you have within your actual field trips the ability to go back and view those in picture form with more in-depth descriptions and even dimensioning of how they'd lay out each of those columns. Here's some pictures that's associated with the PowerPoint. Now we're going to do a quiz. No, that'd be awful. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you here on the spot. So there's the Egyptian columns, classical orders. Here's an example of the Doric. We have the cornice on top, frieze, architrave, then the capital and the shaft. The Ionic has the cornice, the frieze, the architrave, the capital, but with the spiral, the shaft, and then the base. The Corinthian has cornice, frieze, architrave, a capital that has more of the flowered decorative to it, and the shaft and the base. And here's a physical example of that. I think I was on this trip. Hey Cheryl, was this in New York? Oh, okay. Yeah, I had photos of this as well. Yeah, that is crazy. All right, so Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Egyptian Room. And then here's the Epidaurus, Ephesus, Rome, Delphi, not Indiana Delphi. That will be a lot less interesting for you to go visit. All right, so perfect timing. I wanted to pull up a few quick examples of how history is applied to the now. So here I will go to, let's do this one first. So the Xiang Mei Dragon. And here's an example of textile printing. So this is the textile press because they love fabrics. Now this looks like a fairly contemporary print, something that I might even see and we'll say, I don't want to lowbrow it, but we'll say Pier 1 or maybe even more beautiful than that. But it's something I wouldn't mind having in my house is the main point that I'm getting at. All of the colors are very beautiful and vibrant. But what it was based off of, it says it's a modern interpretation of Chancery originating from the 1920s Art Deco block print. It became part of the world-renowned Schmucker collection in 2006. Today it is one of the most iconic designs now produced by table printing. This form of screen printing involves fabric being stretched and secured to the top of the table, and then the screens that hold the design are moved gradually down. Printing pattern repeated by pattern repeat. So I'm going to pause for a second because I saw that somebody left and I can't see all of your names, so I see that there's 9 of you. I'm going to read off names. What about caller 2? Is that someone who's already listed? I just want to make sure that I don't count somebody absent who's really here. Go ahead. So let's see. Amber, Caitlin Catanzarite, Caitlin Miller. I have a caller 2, Liz DeLu, Madeline, Nicole Catlett, Omar, Tan. So that puts me at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I just had a caller 3 come back on. Who is that? Who just rejoined? So I have Amber, Caitlin, Liz, Madeline, Nicole, Omar, and Tan. Who am I missing in the chat? I can unmute you for a minute, and if you want to just say who you are.
Allison, it's Mary.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Mary.
Yes.
I'll go ahead and mute everybody again. Okay, so I got my other person. I just wanted to make sure that no one was counted out for being here. So going back to the example of modern interpretation of Chancery, I think that things like this can be incorporated into some of your future projects, and it just shows how you're transitioning from history and all of that thought that was put into things back then that really should be the level of thought that we put into our interiors now. We want to use all the design principles and elements, but on top of that, thinking about how space unfolds and deeper concepts of applying those, the history does a great job at the best shining examples of that. I love this print. Outside of the print of the fabric, I have a less interesting example, but I think it's really interesting, this website. So I just randomly searched Greek-inspired decor, and it came up with a website that does nothing but sell, you know, famous busts or statuettes and even coats of arms and sword blades. Just how much of a market there is. The fact that this website exists shows me that there are people incorporating this for good or for worse into their homes. Now, it really depends on your culture too, for good or for worse. It might be a sore thumb, but I had a Greek gentleman buy one of my older homes, and he did a really great job. He actually built columns into the house and took a modern home and implemented Greek culture throughout all of it. And because even the pool he changed, it ended up working out. It was a small ranch. So being able to do that in a good, tactful way is something that we'll be working on in this class. Another example I have, a little bit more modern. So this is House Design, Food and Travel by House and Garden. And here was an example of a modern interpretation of Greek design. So we can see the abstraction of the columns. And then within this house, and you'd have to be a member to see the full article, but within the house they have varying artifacts that they're showing on display, and then furniture that's period specific. But I thought extremely modern and fun to look at. Almost like an art gallery, but this is really someone's living space. So there's how we can apply it to the now. Like I said, be trying to look through and find your own possible examples. I'm going to make a clearer exercise later where we go searching for some of these. All right, so let me close out of those. And I'm going to go back into our session and click on session 3 again. Make sure I've covered everything that you need for homework. I believe do we all have our books at this point? If you don't have your book, then go ahead and type it in the chat or see me. I'm pretty sure session 3, you know, we had the first 3 chapters, but there's not any extra chapters. So if you don't have your book, we're past the point where I can scan it in, but I'd like to know that information. This week for homework, we're going to have the visual assignment. We're going to have a couple of quizzes, okay? So more quizzes than you're used to, but as I said, I've cut them down in size, so it's going to be about 7 to 10 questions, maybe less than that for a few of these. Be thinking on that foundations question. Like I said, if enough people can't figure it out, I will cut it. But there were a few, so we'll say 4 of you of the 14 that understood it. So now that I've explained it as a whole, I'm hoping it's clearer. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 quizzes, early Christian to the Gothic, and some of them are very small reading chapters, so it's not as daunting as it feels looking at the list here. We have our virtual field trips, which I've made active, Islamic architecture, Islamic art and geometric design, and Islamic geometric art presented by Tim Backhouse. So I'm going to click on it, make sure that the links are all active for you. And if not, then I'll write a note for myself to find, because I have a couple more sources that I would use on screen, but I could just add them into your virtual field trips instead. It's having a hard time loading, so it doesn't feel promising. Let me see if this one, okay, so this is not found, so I'll say 2 links might not work. Okay, so one of them does. I'll write a note for myself. 2 new links. So Islamic Geometric Art by Tim Backhouse. So Beauty of Islamic and Geometric Design. Thumbnail copies of images are used on the main page with larger versions available by clicking on them. The larger versions are usually accompanied by description of the site features, a number of projects together with some additional information as follows. So here you can see, and then if you click on a bigger image, then he has the information to the side. And let's click on the gallery. So here we're kind of seeing some of the patterns and then an explanation, Gareth's tile. And some of these are modern interpretations, okay? So you'll have to pay close attention in your reading, but still a unique link. So I'm going to close this. This one never responded. And I'll try to get you some more links to view for your homework. Do I have any questions on the homework assignment and the two options while I have you here? Nobody?
We want to see if they're missing or all that goes there.
Let's see. Mute two of the callers. So no questions. Doesn't mean that I won't be looking for some of them in my email for those of you who don't feel comfortable asking online. Any questions about any past quizzes or homework assignments? Did everything go fine with the formatting this week? I didn't have any emails, so I'm going to assume it's okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and dismiss you all for today, and then next week we'll be moving on into session 4. Enjoy the rest of your week.